Do you feel safer now? Or do old wounds still echo sometimes?
You know what still plays in my head sometimes, like a recording on loop? The way my parents sat me down at the kitchen table, almost rehearsed, and explained that college just wasn't something they could help me with because, as they put it, money's really tight right now. I remember the way my stepmom leaned back in her chair, arms folded, looking at me like she'd already accepted that this was my reality, while my dad kept repeating the phrase about finances like he thought it would soften the blow if he said it enough times. And I believed them. I sat there, nodding, swallowing the lump in my throat, and telling myself that they must be struggling, that maybe bills had piled up, or maybe there were things I didn't know. Because who wants to believe their own parents would look them in the eye and lie about something that life-changing? I told myself I would find another way, that I'd work more hours at my job, that I'd put off classes, that maybe I could start at community college and chip away slowly. I told myself this was just life being unfair, not them being unfair. I spent the next few months juggling shifts, exhausted and stretched thin, trying to save what I could while also questioning whether any of it was even worth it. I saw friends getting help from their families, some of them co-signing loans, others helping with housing, and I tried not to compare, but every time someone casually mentioned their parents wiring them money for books or helping them move into a dorm, it stung in a way I couldn't put into words. I had already lowered my expectations so many times that my own dreams started to feel like luxuries instead of goals, and I remember lying awake one night thinking, this is just how it is, you're on your own, so get used to it. Then, out of nowhere, a few months later, I opened my phone and saw something that made me physically sit up in bed like I had been punched. It was a photo my dad had posted online. He and my stepmom were standing outside a house, grinning ear to ear, holding a big shiny keyring, while my stepsister stood in front of them, her arms spread wide like she had just won the lottery. The caption underneath was full of congratulations, hashtags, and words like proud moment and helping her start her future right. And I just froze. I stared at the screen so long my eyes started to water, not because I was crying yet, but because I couldn't blink. It didn't even compute at first. I had been told money was tight, so tight that my education was off the table, and here they were, buying her a house. Not helping with rent, not helping her find a cheap apartment, handing her the keys to her very own home. The comments underneath made it worse. Family friends were saying things like, you two are the most generous parents ever, and she's so lucky to have you behind her. And my stepsister, of course, had written some long post about how grateful she was and how she would never forget this gift, painting them as saints. And I sat there with my stomach in knots, because no one knew the other side of it. No one knew that while she was getting her house, I was sitting in a tiny rented room, working double shifts, and trying to figure out if I could even afford textbooks for the classes I still hoped to take someday. I wish I could say I was shocked into silence, but it was something worse. I felt humiliated. Because in that moment I realized the truth, money was never the problem. I wasn't the chosen one, I wasn't the investment, I wasn't the daughter they wanted to show off. They had decided that my stepsister's life deserved the big boost, the public celebration, the sacrifice, and I was just supposed to accept scraps, or worse, nothing at all. And here's the part that made it burn deeper. I had never once asked them for anything extravagant. I never asked for a car or expensive clothes or even allowance money like some kids did. The one thing I asked for was support with college, the one thing that could actually change my future, and they looked me dead in the eye and told me it was impossible. Then months later, they turned around and made a spectacle out of gifting her something most people my age couldn't even dream of. I didn't say anything right away. I didn't comment on the post, I didn't call them, I didn't even text my stepsister. I just sat with it, the anger simmering under the surface like a kettle about to boil over. Because how do you even process that kind of betrayal? How do you even wrap your head around the fact that the people who are supposed to want the best for you have already decided you're not worth investing in? And that night, as I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying their words about money being tight in my head, I knew something had shifted permanently. Because the lie wasn't about money at all. It was about where their loyalty was, and it sure as hell wasn't with me. That's the moment I stopped feeling guilty about the resentment I carried. that's the moment I realized that whatever bond one thought we had wasn't real, at least not in the way I had always wanted it to be. And that's the moment I started to understand that I would never forget the way they chose her future over mine. And if I'm being honest, that was also the moment I started to think about revenge. Not screaming, not begging, not demanding, but revenge. Something quieter, smarter, and permanent. Because if they thought I was just going to swallow this and keep smiling at family dinners, they had no idea who I was about to become. When I finally gathered the courage to bring it up, it was not in the calm and measured way I had rehearsed in my head a dozen times, but in a moment where the frustration that had been building for weeks spilled over. And I found myself calling my dad and blurting out the question that had been eating me alive. How could they look me in the eye, swear to me that money was too tight for college, and then turn around and buy my stepsister a house? Something I had never even dared to imagine asking for. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that tells you the person is already figuring out how to spin their way out, and then he started talking in that tone he always used when he wanted to shut me down without sounding harsh, saying things like, "It's not what you think, and you don't understand the circumstances," which, honestly, made my blood boil because I understood perfectly well. They had chosen her, plain and simple. I told him that while I was working double shifts just to keep my head above water, they were handing her the keys to a life most people my age could only dream of, and I could hear my stepmom in the background chiming in with her sharp little comments, saying things like, "This isn't about you being left out, it's about your stepsister needing stability," as if stability wasn't something I needed too, as if the fact that I was fighting to pay rent and afford books was just a hobby instead of a reality that was crushing me every single day. The more I pushed back, the more they flipped the script, and suddenly the conversation wasn't about their betrayal anymore, but about my supposed selfishness, with my dad saying, "I can't believe you're jealous of your sister. This isn't healthy." And my stepmom accusing me of being bitter and ungrateful, like the fact that I hadn't cut them off sooner was something they deserved a medal for. I sat there gripping the phone, listening to them gaslight me, and I felt this shift deep inside me, this recognition that I was not going to get the truth from them, because in their world, they had already rewritten the story. In their version, they were generous, selfless parents doing the right thing, and I was the resentful daughter who couldn't be happy for her stepsister, who couldn't let go of the past, and who made everything about money when it was, according to them, about love and support. But love, at least the kind they were selling, seemed to only flow one direction in that house, and I wasn't the recipient of it. I tried to explain one last time that I didn't care about having a house, that I wasn't angry because of the material difference, but because of the blatant lie. Because they had looked at me with a straight face and told me they couldn't help me when the truth was they chose not to help me, and instead of acknowledging that pain, they twisted it back around and painted me as the villain. And when my dad raised his voice and said, "You don't know how hard it's been for us, you don't know what sacrifices we've made," I snapped, because if buying my stepsister a home was a sacrifice, then what exactly had they sacrificed for me? By the end of that call, nothing was resolved, and if anything, it was worse, because I hung up knowing that there would never be accountability, there would never be an apology, and there would never be a moment where they admitted that what they did was unfair. Instead, they would keep parading my stepsister's success around, patting themselves on the back for being the kind of parents who set their kids up for life, while pretending my education and my struggles were simply my burden to carry. I wish I could tell you I felt relief after confronting them, but what I really felt was clarity, the kind of clarity that slams the door shut on hope. Because in that call, I heard not just their words, but their priorities, and I realized that whatever fantasy I had been holding onto about them one day seeing my side was never going to happen. They had made their choice, and their choice was not me. When I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, staring at my phone like maybe they would call back and say something different, maybe they would apologize, maybe they would finally admit the truth. But the call never came, and as the hours turned into days and the days into weeks, I stopped expecting it. What did come instead were pictures, family updates, holiday invites, all carefully excluding me unless it was convenient to make the group look whole. That was when I understood something I should have grasped long ago. I was not their daughter in the way I thought I was, not in the way that counted, not in the way that guaranteed even a baseline of fairness. And that realization didn't break me the way I expected it to. Instead, it hardened me, made me see that waiting for them to act like real parents was a waste of time, and that my energy was better spent elsewhere, building something on my own. And as I sat there, replaying every word of that disastrous confrontation, I felt the first sparks of something new forming inside me, something that wasn't sadness or longing anymore, but a determination that if they thought they had written me out of the story, they hadn't considered what happens when the person you push out decides to write their own ending. And while they probably thought that conversation was the last word on the matter, what they didn't realize was that it was only the beginning. In the weeks after that phone call, something inside me shifted in a way that didn't feel dramatic or impulsive, but more like a slow unraveling of whatever thread had still connected me to the idea that I owed them explanations or second chances. And it wasn't out of spite or anger anymore. Not really, but more out of this growing understanding that I had been clinging to an illusion for far too long, a version of family that had never truly existed for me the way it did for my stepsister. And maybe never would have, no matter how much I tried to prove myself or how many times I made peace first. I didn't send angry messages or block their numbers or make any public declarations about cutting ties. I just started removing them quietly from the center of my life. The same way you slowly shift a piece of furniture that never quite fit in the room but you kept around out of habit or obligation, even though it never brought you any comfort. I focused on what I could control, which wasn't much at first: my job, my part-time classes, the bills I was barely keeping up with, the late nights I spent writing essays on borrowed laptops and free Wi-Fi, trying to keep my hope alive even as the exhaustion piled up, and there were days I wanted to give up, honestly. But then something else would kick in, some part of me that had always been stubborn about not letting them be right, not letting their neglect be the final word on what I was worth. So I kept going, not with some big, inspiring goal in mind, but because stopping felt like letting them win. Every once in a while, I'd get texts from my dad, short, vague messages asking how I was or telling me about some family dinner coming up, and I could tell from the tone that he wasn't ready to address anything real, but just wanted me to reappear. To keep playing the role I had always played in family gatherings, smiling and nodding and pretending things were fine, just so they wouldn't have to feel uncomfortable. But I never answered. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because I had finally understood that answering meant agreeing to their version of the story, and I wasn't going to play that part anymore. What surprised me most wasn't how easy it became to distance myself, but how quickly they stopped trying once it became clear I wasn't bending anymore. The invites stopped. The check-ins stopped. The calls dried up. It was like they had replaced me with someone easier, someone who never questioned them, someone who was easier to brag about, someone who came with less emotional debt. And maybe that should have hurt more than it did, but honestly, it just confirmed everything I had already started to suspect. And then, just when I had started to adjust to the silence, just when I was finally finding some peace in not expecting anything from them at all, something happened that made everything tilt in my direction, not because I planned it. And not because I had finally confronted them again, but because life, in its weird way, handed me a kind of justice that felt almost too perfect to be real. It started with a message from an old friend of the family, someone who had always straddled the line between polite distance and subtle awareness, and her words were cautious but loaded. Just thought you should know, your stepsister's having a hard time. The house is in trouble. Your parents are scrambling. I didn't respond at first, partly because I didn't know how to react, and partly because I had trained myself to avoid getting pulled back into their world, but the curiosity grew too loud to ignore, and eventually I checked social media, not her page, but the pages of those peripheral family friends who always posted too much. And sure enough, there it was, buried between posts about summer vacations and new recipes, a vague post from my stepmom, asking for prayers and strength during a difficult time and thanking people for their support as we navigate some challenges with our family. I stared at it, not knowing whether to laugh or feel sorry, because the very people who had told me they couldn't spare a dollar to help me build a future had apparently gambled everything on one person, and now that choice was crumbling around them. And while I didn't feel glee, at least not the kind of glee you imagine in stories about revenge, I felt something else, something quieter and deeper, something that felt like balance. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because it showed me that I had been right to walk away, that my silence hadn't been weakness, but strength, and that sometimes, the best revenge isn't saying anything at all. It's letting people sit in the consequences they created while you quietly build the life they never believed you could. I didn't tell anyone what I knew, and I didn't reach out to ask questions or offer help, even though a part of me, a very old, very tired part, still wanted to be the bigger person. But that part didn't win this time, because I remembered the nights I cried over tuition and textbooks, the months I spent trying to stretch $30 into meals and bus fare, and I reminded myself that no one had reached out then, not once, not sincerely. So I closed the app, put my phone away, and got back to my paper, because I had something they couldn't take from me anymore, my direction. And as I sat there typing, surrounded by things I had earned on my own, I felt that familiar pull of anger fade into something else entirely, the calm of knowing that I no longer needed their approval or their explanations. They had written me off a long time ago. They just never expected I'd be the one writing the ending. I think the thing that still gets me isn't just the betrayal itself, because at a certain point, I had made peace with the fact that I was never their priority, but the way they kept performing, publicly and shamelessly. As if everything they'd ever done had come from a place of love, as if there weren't entire pieces of their own family history that they had buried under layers of carefully polished social media posts and scripted family updates, where I existed only when it was convenient. To pretend they had raised two daughters with equal care, when in reality, I had been edited out like a typo they were hoping no one would notice. For months, they posted glowing updates about my stepsister's life, painting her as this hardworking young woman building her future with grace and gratitude, never once acknowledging that the house she was standing in front of was bought with the money they claimed didn't exist when I needed help, and people believed it, because why wouldn't they? On the surface, they looked like the kind of parents everyone wants, the generous ones, the stable ones, the ones who make sacrifices for their kids and show up to every event with supportive smiles and inspirational quotes, and for a while, I tried to let it go, tried to accept that the truth didn't matter as long as I was doing okay. But the longer I watched them bask in the praise they didn't deserve, the more it began to eat at me, not because I wanted credit or sympathy, but because I knew the damage they had done. And watching them rewrite history so easily felt like letting them get away with it entirely. So when an opportunity came along to tell the truth, not in a vengeful, public-shaming way, but in a subtle, undeniable way, I didn't hesitate. It happened at a family gathering I wasn't invited to directly, but a cousin of mine, one of the few relatives who had quietly stayed in touch without ever picking sides, sent me a message saying she thought I should come, that it might be time. I almost said no, not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because I didn't want to walk into a room full of people who had chosen to believe the curated version of events, who had clapped along while my parents built their narrative on half-truths and omissions. But something in her message felt different, like maybe the time was right to stop hiding. So I showed up, not with a speech, not with accusations, but with calm. I smiled. I said hello. I made polite small talk. And then, when the topic of college came up, because it always does when there's nothing else to brag about, and someone asked my dad how proud he must have been when I got into school, he hesitated just long enough for the room to notice. And that was all I needed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't roll my eyes. I just said, with a tone so casual it almost felt rehearsed, "Oh, I got in, yeah, but I couldn't go full-time because Dad said they couldn't afford to help." I smiled, took a sip of my drink, and kept my eyes steady. You could hear the air shift. My stepmom tried to recover with some vague excuse about timing and resources, but the damage was done, because people remembered. People had seen the house photos. People knew. And you could feel them doing the math in real time. After that night, things began to crack, not loudly, not all at once, but with the quiet discomfort that spreads when a lie is exposed just enough to make everyone question what else has been hidden. The comments on their social media posts became more restrained. The likes dwindled. The admiration started to cool. And while they never admitted anything to me, I knew from the way my dad's texts changed, shorter, less confident, more passive, that they felt it too. But the real moment, the one that sealed everything, came a few weeks later, when my stepsister, who had always been polite in that vague, detached way you are with people you're forced to share holidays with, called me out of the blue. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity won. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't apologize. What she did was worse. She asked me to clear things up with the extended family because, in her words, it's causing unnecessary tension and, honestly, it's not fair to mom and dad after everything they've done. That's when it hit me, not just that she didn't get it, but that she never would. To her, the house was a gift she had earned, not a symbol of imbalance or erasure. To her, my story was just an inconvenience, a wrinkle in an otherwise smooth family narrative. And to my parents, I was still the problem, not because I had lied, but because I had refused to keep theirs. I told her I wouldn't be clearing up anything, that if people were uncomfortable, it was probably because they were finally seeing the truth, and if that truth made them question their own blind loyalty, then maybe that was something worth sitting with. She didn't respond. She hung up. And I haven't heard from her since. But what I have heard are the silences, the lack of invites, the awkward check-ins, the quiet tension that now follows every photo they post or every story they try to tell. And those silences, ironically, have been louder than any revenge I could have planned. Because while they spent years crafting a version of themselves that looked perfect on the outside, it only took a few truths spoken plainly, without anger, to unravel that illusion. And now, for the first time, they're the ones who feel like outsiders. They're the ones trying to manage the optics, to control the fallout. And me? I'm not interested in managing anything anymore. I'm just living, without them, without lies, and without the weight of needing to explain myself to people who never asked the right questions in the first place. They wanted control of the narrative. What they didn't count on was what happens when the girl they dismissed decides to speak. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just clearly and without looking back. There's this moment people don't talk about enough. Not the one where you get revenge. Not the one where they finally realize what they did. Not even the one where you watch everything around them start to fall apart. But the one where you stop caring whether they notice at all, because by then, you've built something so far removed from the wreckage they left behind that their recognition, their regret, and even their attempts to make things right just don't hold the weight they once did. And when that moment hits, it's not dramatic or loud, it's not even satisfying in the way I imagined it would be when I was still angry. It's just quiet, solid, and irreversible. That was the space I had finally reached when my parents, after months of awkward silence, subtle social decline, and a slowly unraveling family image, decided to show up again, not in person, not with apologies, but with an email so carefully worded, so deliberately polished that I knew immediately it wasn't about me. Not really, but about restoring whatever version of the family they were still trying to sell to everyone else. The email started with phrases like, "We've been thinking about you," and "We'd love to reconnect," which might have meant something if they hadn't followed it up with a lengthy explanation about how things haven't been easy with my stepsister lately, and how families should support each other, and then, tucked between paragraphs like an afterthought, a half apology that didn't mention the house, or college, or the fact that I had been erased from their lives for years except when they needed me to play a role that made them look whole. They didn't ask how I was doing. They didn't acknowledge anything specific. What they wanted, and it was painfully obvious, was a reset button, something clean and convenient that would allow them to act like none of it had happened. But I wasn't interested in pretending anymore. I wasn't interested in offering them an easy way out of their own mess. I had spent too long struggling, questioning my worth, carrying the weight of silence, and clawing my way out of a place they had put me in with a smile and a lie, and I wasn't going to let them rewrite the ending now that the story no longer benefited them. So I waited a few days, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to respond without heat, without emotion, without anything that could be used to paint me as bitter or unforgiving. I wanted the truth to hit them in a way they couldn't spin or deny. And when I finally replied, I didn't rant or list grievances or demand anything. I simply told them the truth. I said that I had spent years believing that if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, and proved myself often enough, maybe one day they'd see me, not just as a daughter, but as someone worth investing in. I told them that I had accepted their excuses, justified their decisions, and convinced myself it was my job to keep the family from splintering, even when I was the one being left out of every major decision and celebration. I told them that the house wasn't what broke me, it was the lie, the ease with which they excluded me, and the way they expected me to be grateful for whatever crumbs were left after they had built an entire life around someone else. And then I told them that I was doing fine now, that I had built a life they weren't a part of, that I had learned what it felt like to choose myself over and over again until it stopped feeling like rebellion and started feeling like freedom. I told them that while I didn't hate them, I also didn't need them. And most importantly, I told them that I would not be coming back, not to the holidays, not to the family updates, not to the dinner tables where I was never really invited to speak. After I sent the email, I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't check my inbox obsessively or wonder how they took it. I knew what they'd do, either spin it into another version of events that made them feel less guilty or ignore it altogether and move on like they always had. And honestly, I was fine with either outcome. Because by that point, my silence wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about peace. But the final move, the part of the story that still makes me smile when I think about how full circle it all came, wasn't the email, or the confrontation, or even the truth finally coming to light. It was what I did afterward, quietly and without fanfare. I started a scholarship fund. Not a big one, just enough to help students like me, kids who had been told that money was tight, or that dreams had to be postponed, or that they should settle for less because someone else's needs were more urgent. I funded it through freelance work, side gigs, and eventually through a business I built from the ground up, without their help, without their encouragement, and without their money. And on the anniversary of the day I saw that photo, the one with the house and the keys and the fake smiles, I launched the fund publicly, attaching a story to it. Not with names or details, but just enough truth to make people think, just enough honesty to let it stand on its own. And when I got the first message from a student thanking me, telling me that someone finally saw them, really saw them, I knew I had won. Not because I had destroyed them. Not because I had shamed them. But because I had taken everything they refused to give me and turned it into something better than they ever could have imagined. And now, when people ask about my family, I don't flinch. I don't explain. I just say, we don't speak anymore. And when they ask why, I just smile and say, it's a long story, but it ends exactly the way it was supposed to.